Okay. Looks like we're live.
Great.
All right, everybody. Hello. It's Tim and Max back again with our session on reimagining Contentlayer. I know, Tim, you did some work on your own on this. I think it was last week. Um, Maybe you want to recap what you were working on last week?
Yeah. Last week I took off from where we got to last time, which was getting something up and running so we could start iterating on the API. Um, so got that part done and then started working on what sources would look like and what plugins might look like. So made some progress there and kind of finished the stream at that point. So we're kind of at the stage where we probably start to need to refine the plugin API a bit and work out how the source would then pass information into our document schemas. And then once we've worked that part out, then we can actually start generating the content and having something ready to start using in a project.
Cool.
So I guess just for to bring you up to speed and also everyone else, what would be the best place to start? If we maybe go to source, um, so at this stage, I've made source directly extend a stream, and I think last time I was on, I didn't. I changed it since I was on stream to output a context. And the reason being is each plugin will probably want to contribute something unique to the output. And a context seemed like the best way of getting typed keys in that map without having conflicts.
Cool. That sounds
And
interesting. So the
like
context for each plugin, they emit metadata about themselves?
yeah, so if we have to take a look at the file system source. It's a source that outputs content meta and file system meta. So content meta is an interface where you can access the content of a file. So you can get a stream, or you can get a string content, or you can get binary content. And then the file system plugin also adds metadata like the file path or the stat information. So the idea is you could have another source that outputs the content meta as well as, I don't know, if it's from a database, it could add some extra information like the ID or something.
So is the idea you could yield the file system source, that's or maybe I guess how would you access the context emitted by a source if you needed to? Is the idea that the user has the ability, excuse me, to access that context, or is that kind of going to be abstracted away and you would basically just get access to that context somehow through like some other API?
Yeah, I'm still not sure how we would then turn this context into something the schema would consume. Because right now we have the fields which are just string to a schema or just a plain map. So we go to document, or maybe if we go to our test config, which would probably illustrate it better. So we have our source and then fields. So I'm still not quite sure how these will pull information from the source. In this case, we would probably want these particular fields to come from the front meta of the markdown. So I kind of need to work out a way of getting information out of the source into fields without having like naming conflicts. So like, for example, you might have a body field in the front matter, but also you want to access the body of the markdown document. So we just need a way of working around those conflicts. Maybe one way of doing it is we could do like source star. Maybe it could come from the source plugin. I don't know. Source plugin, the front matter.
That could be an interesting. I guess what would be an example that you could think of like another source um currently that we'd want to support that like wouldn't be like a markdown document. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Uh, I guess it could be like YAML or TOML. You might want to pass those. Those will be more straightforward to markdown because usually they go straight to a structured output that doesn't need any additional processing.
Yeah, because like the thing I could see being a problem with the definition of a document, if you have fields defined that way, is like, let's say that you're using a file system source, which is pulling in like Markdown or TOML, and you accidentally like, write front matter field or something like that. Would you then just like
Yeah.
get an error at runtime, or would that type check?
Yeah, I guess because we're using context, we can add type safety. So like the fields here can check that the information they're accessing is actually in the source.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense.
Um, Otherwise, we scrap that idea and just use a plain object.
I think like the initial version that we're building out here, we should just focus specifically on Markdown or MDX documents, like just
Mm,
focus on the like most common content type, and then because otherwise we're not like I think we should focus on Markdown and MDX, and then like add on later,
yeah,
if that
definitely.
makes sense.
Um, so
So
I'm
like
using,
the the document definition would basically the fields would actually just be straight up one-to-one mapped to like front
yeah.
matter fields. You know what I mean?
So I started working on plugins in the last stream as well. And currently plugins are just a function that takes in a source and returns a new source. And the nice thing about using context was you can like quite easily just like add on things that you are adding to the context. But if we have a markdown plugin, you kind of have to in would become like a record that takes in like the file system information and then returns something that adds like a key to that record. So if you receive file system information and then return the file system information with additional fields, like I've now passed the body out of the markdown document in the front matter. So you might go and front matter body. But then the problem then becomes how do you pass that into your, because the document fields are flat at the moment. We got a document. Oh wow. Sample config. we just have a flat set of fields. And then if you start just adding random keys in here, it's like it becomes like a nested structure.
Right.
So I'm wondering if we have like an additional configuration that maps the output of the source to a flat fields object. Or maybe there's a better way.
Well, so so can you show me an example? Like, I don't know if this is working currently, but can you show me an example of like you using a plugin currently? Like with what you built here, let's like the source plugin thing.
Yep, so this is using a plugin here. It's using this remark one, which what does it do right now? Currently, it's just adding the unified output to the context. The value is the output of the processor, and data is like the metadata that the processor adds. So from the remark, this would be the output markdown, and this would be an object that looks like it has a front meta field on it. I should be able to. Wonder if I can get a working example.
Yeah, because I think if we have something running through the plugin, it's probably going to be a little more easy for us to think about like
Yeah.
uh then what becomes like the best user experience that we could provide for plugins. Because again, I think if we like scope ourselves down to just considering Markdown and MDX files at the moment and building plugins around those, we can always add document types on top of everything later. But
Mhm.
I think the focus should be on Markdown and MDX documents because that's probably going to be the most common um probably going to be the most common content type that we deal with.
So last time I added this service as well, which takes the stream of config and then turns it into a stream of past documents.
Cool.
So for each time the config gets emitted from the config builder, it will let in the documents in that config, and then for each document type, it will consume the source, and you'll get back the outputted, well, you'll get the past output. And at the moment, it's just logging it. Maybe we can run this.
Yeah, that'd be
We'll get
cool.
it running. Uh, TSX scratch pad. Is it in the scratch pad?
Is your terminal outside of the current window that you have opened? Or can you split your NeoVim into a terminal as well?
Um, I'm currently just in a new tab. Yeah, I think that's what I did. Yep.
Just 1 second, I'm going to turn my light on and close my door.
Module not valid.
The reason I ask is because we can't actually see what you're running right now.
Oh, right. That's funny. This is the way Ghosty works, I guess.
There we go.
Build. Maybe I'll just open the debug session. Let's go to CX packages. Okay. So that's the document schema there. And here's our source output. If I go back to document builder, pull in console. Dir. Cool.
Nice.
In this context object, we have the content meta, which is a bunch of effects and streams for consuming the content. File system meta, which has the path in the stat information, and then the output from our plugin. So here you can see the front meta. It looks like this is just the whole markdown document.
So if the plugin, okay, thinking about this from like a user perspective, right? A user is going to define a document. They're going to define the schema of the fields in the document. They're going to define a source. And then
Yeah.
that source may also have plugins. Um,
Mm-hmm.
the user, generally speaking, like is not going to want to have to configure much about. They should be able to configure the plugin, but they're not going to want to have to configure it up front. Like it shouldn't be a requirement, right? So how do we take what the plugin is currently generating here, like and make it into something useful, right? Because right now, the um we have like these 3 different context meta thingies that we're emitting, but the engine should somehow eventually turn this into like document information, right?
Yeah.
So what's the thought? I don't know if you got this far, but what is your thought process on like how that should work within the plugins? Is the plugin going to define each successive transformation, or is the plugin literally additive only? Is there like supposed to be a final plugin that does the work of doing the final transformation and you know and checking it against the schema of the document? I guess those are my questions. So I don't know if you got that far in your last stream.
No, I didn't get that far. Um, we could probably like package up a source for Markdown, so you only have to do like use one API. So currently, file system doesn't really care about what the content is; it just reads things from the disk. But if we had like a file system Markdown source, maybe that would be the better experience.
I almost think that so I almost think, and tell me if you think I'm nuts, but I almost think like the source, it should be decoupled from I'm going to use the term like destination or transformer or whatever, right? But the source is just where the documents come from, right? But then a source, we could like have the source take, I don't know, an array of transformers, or we could put like have destinations or targets for that file system source. I don't know what the best term is, but basically, like instead of thinking about it as like a plugin for a source, we can think of it more as like the source just responsible for pulling the document and adding whatever metadata is related to the source. And then like what we're currently calling plugins could be like sinks for a source. Do you know what I mean? And what's cool about that kind of idea is like, let's say we have a like a markdown sync where we, or something like that, where we take the file system source and we transform it to markdown. You could also have another sync that's doing some other work on those markdown documents that you get from the file system. And in addition, you could like pipe the source through like transformers, which would be like the equivalent of like plugins
Mm.
that then the sync would receive to output like the final information. I don't know if any of that makes any sense, but like I think that decoupling the like the source from the destination feels like the right thing to me. What do you think?
Uh, I think I'm not sure if sync is the right abstraction.
Sync, not like the effect sync, more just like
Yeah,
sync as like a destination.
destination.
Because like the source is gonna read like your markdown from like the file system, or it could
Mm.
also potentially read markdown from like a CMS in the future, right?
Yeah,
The source gets the documents, but then there we have to have something that takes those documents and turns them into something consumable.
yeah,
Um,
actually. Yeah, so if we, this could be CMS. You're thinking an additional field, like plugins.
maybe. Um, I'm not exactly sure like what the best way to think think about it is, or to do this is. But I'm just thinking that the end result, right? If we think about like what the end result of the current version of Contentlayer is, the end result of Contentlayer as it stands currently is essentially um like
Basically, just
JSON. Yeah,
these with
it's
the computed
JSON.
fields.
It's JSON, the computed fields, and the markdown that you need to render. And if it's MDX, it's the MDX, right? It's the body.
I think it does add metadata, but I can't remember what that is.
It does add some metadata, to depending on what source you've used. So like the file system source has path information that you get
Just,
access to.
I'm just looking at the effect website. Uh, is it blog?
It's under everything. Yeah,
Slug.
the all. Are you looking for the output, or are you just looking for documents
Yeah, I
or
feel
the
like
schemas?
my current project isn't built. That's probably not a good idea. Yeah, and I don't want to build it because it takes ages. Plugins. Yeah, just need to think about how we go from source to fields.
And and maybe Maybe in like the first version that we're designing here, maybe the best thing to do is to have one source, one destination. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So like what you have here is probably like good enough for us to start with, where like the remark plugin here um is like um the thing that actually will take whatever it gets and output to the file system. But
Well,
yeah,
you
I
probably
think
want
like
to add, like, for the effect website, we also add remark plugins for passing the code blocks and stuff. So we'll probably need to work out how that works too at some point. But if we try get this working just with front matter in the markdown body, I think it's a good start.
I agree. I think we
And
need to do a little
currently,
research. And we also probably need to do a little research into like remark and rehype plugins. 'Cause I think the current version of Contentlayer supports both remark and rehype plugins.
your rehypes for going to HTML, is that right?
I think so. Wait, look. Rehype is a tool that transforms HTML with plugins.
Okay.
These plugins can inspect and change the HTML. Yeah. And then remark, I'm assuming, is the markdown processor.
It's gonna go remark. I feel like in the effect website remark, we're not rendering to HTML, but we're using like a React component that does it.
Uh, I don't know. Let me look.
Website log log page.
Yeah, the slug page is probably what we want.
Alpha
Yeah, we're using
MDX.
yeah, so all of our posts on the Effect website are MDX, right? Most of them.
Yeah.
And so yeah, I think are just taking the output because Contentlayer generates MDX code, and then we just take it and output it and use MDX component. What is that?
Content is a string.
Get MDX component? What's get MDX component? So
We'll take a look at the website configuration first.
next
Log.
Contentlayer hook.
Where is the actual body of the post defined here? Is it just automatically added?
Yeah, the body is automatically added by Contentlayer currently.
Okay.
I'm just looking at what this like all these hooks do. Yeah, I guess next Contentlayer is doing some stuff to take the code string and output it as a an MDX component. But um the current version of the website defect website. If I look at like the generated code for a blog, for example, yeah, the body of like the generated Contentlayer code, for example, the body has the raw MDX, and then it has a second. There's a body field. It has a raw field, which is just the
Yeah.
raw like content of the file, and then there's a code field, which is like the compiled, bundled MDX, like transformed to JavaScript.
So Latch, it's the body field related first. And
Yeah, so
then the
that
metadata fields are just prefixes of underscore.
yeah, I mean we don't necessarily have to follow this like
Mm,
structure, but I think that at a minimum, we have to output all of the fields that we define, both like the regular static fields and the computed fields. And we also need to probably omit the source metadata somehow if we can.
okay. Maybe if we rework the source a bit then. I
We
think the
don't know.
stream is still okay, but the output of the stream, maybe if we go back to a plain object, we update content meta. So every source should kind of output a similar or the same structure, I guess.
It should output the same structure, but the metadata that the source provides can be different, right?
Hmm.
Because like for the file system source, for example, you get like file system information, but for like a CMS source, you might get like other things. So I feel like maybe a source.
We have output. feel like the source should always have content. On the website, it had a bunch of metadata fields. What was they again?
Yeah,
Like a two generated.
for the file system source, you get stuff about like the file systems, like the source file path, source file name,
Yeah,
source file directory, the content type, and then the flattened path. Although I don't particularly like any of those names. But
raw. I guess I feel like we did use some of those.
we
And
do in the computed fields, but if you look at
yeah,
the implementation I had for the computed fields previously, in the source, the file system source that you provide,
yeah.
um, is able to like forward those fields along to the computed fields.
So one of them is ID. We are using like these paths and things to generate the slugs somewhere, but I feel like they should be computed fields anyway. Uh, Maybe if I just quickly search the project to see if we're using these.
Like
Oh yeah, we're using it for like navigation and things. For creating
I wonder
breadcrumbs.
if it, I wonder if if a source, um, like in the way I had originally like defined a source, even though it was kind of dumb, um, it was able to, it defined the stuff that it was going to emit. Do you know what I mean? So like
Yeah,
when you specify, when I specified like file system source, for example, um, like it defined, oh, I'm going to emit into whatever result. I'm going to emit, you know, my path name, file name, blah, 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 blah. So instead of like ID and raw and all of this, I wonder if we should emit under a key called like source meta or just source.
yeah.
You, do you know what I mean?
Um, yeah, so we kind of have like two parts to output. There's like the metadata and then the fields. And the fields is just a record of string unknown. And then the metadata content. This isn't really meta, it's content.
Like source meta. It's not really content meta, right?
So this is just a way, or the source provides a way of reading the content. Um, and currently it's lazy. So it only reads the content at the point where it's necessary. But I feel like content meta isn't the right name for it. Maybe it should just be called content. Source content. And source meta.
Yeah, because like I think you were onto something before when you said there's basically two things where you need to emit. There's the metadata that the source is providing, and then there's the fields, both
Yeah.
like the static fields and the computed fields, right? So when we emit that like JSON result, I almost feel like we could have literally, or and there's technically a third field, right? The actual like body of whatever we generated,
Mm.
which could probably go under source metadata, but um the two main things we generate are like besides the actual content, whatever we're generating in terms of like fields, it's the source metadata and the
Yeah,
source
I
metadata and the
guess
fields.
this metadata will be different depending on the source you use. Um, because you don't have a file directory for a CMS usually.
I agree. That's why I think the source should define the metadata that it provides to the result. Do
Mm.
you know what I mean? So
Yeah.
like when you plug a source onto a document, the document now knows, okay, in my result, I'm going to have XYZ pieces of metadata.
If I go to tutorials page, there was a place where these fields were used. Yeah. Is this typed? Any, yes. Okay. Yep, so the types are generated separately.
Yeah, and the
Raw document
types,
data.
some of the types are actually invalid as well. Um, for example,
It's,
in some of the documents that are emit, there's like a JSON type which actually doesn't
yeah.
exist.
Yeah, so I guess here the type is assuming that it's always going to be a file system document.
It depends on the source plugin you plug into Contentlayer.
Okay.
The types are generated at runtime as well. Sorry,
Um,
the types are generated at build time.
right. So I feel like a source also needs some kind of generic or so we can infer the metadata structure.
I agree.
What have we got here?
So the
Oh, look at that.
meta, yeah, that metadata I think was the original piece that I had put in there, where in my original source, like again, my source was really dumb, but I had a way to infer the meta, at least in the computed fields. I hadn't gotten to the point of like
Yeah.
where how that fits into the document, but the
And,
document I think tracks its source on the type level. So you could
yeah.
theoretically extract the all of the type information you need.
Okay. Content output fields. And output fields is what will go to the actual fields of our document. Mm, still doesn't feel quite right, but we'll just roll with it for now. Oh, it's just a bit of the things that are useful are path, name, directory, content type. What is flattened path? File extension removed and index removed.
Yeah, I don't think we should put flattened path in there, but it's just me. I think like we should mimic almost the structure of path.parse. Do you know what I mean? Like a parsed path,
Pass
a
path.
Node.js, like a Node.js path, blah, Node.js parsed path.
Okay. What does
Like
that look like?
if you import, if you want to see what the type looks like, I don't know if you've seen it, but like if you just import path, we can take a look at the type. You can see if you think I'm nuts.
Artist.
Yeah, so you get
Oh yeah.
the root, the directory, the base, the extension, and the name. So that basically gives us all the pieces.
Okay. So how about file system beta equals, we want to add the full path and the info. Oh, do we want the info in there? At some point we're going to need this for like caching and stuff. Because we want to know when things are modified or not. Is that how it works in Contentlayer?
It's cached based on the hash of the document's content,
Okay.
I think.
Hmm.
Oh no, wait, no, no. It's cache. Wait. Let me check. Um, so no, I was wrong. It's cached based on the hash of the content layer configuration file, I think, which is not, we want to do better, basically. So M time is fine with me, but there may not technically be like um trying to think if the string hash in effect is deterministic, right?
String hash is deterministic. Yeah, so the hash module always returns the same number for the same string. Is that what you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we could do like we don't necessarily need the file info then for caching purposes because we could just do the hash of the file content. Um, and you know we might get collisions once in a while, but well, we could use M time as well. It doesn't matter, but
Uh, just wondering how we would extract the shape of the metadata depending on the source. So this will be the shape of the meta field. kind of just need to add it to the known structure then. I've never generally generic tags are a bad idea, but let's see how it goes. At the moment, just kind of stumbling
Yeah,
around until we find something that works.
I think that so I'm just trying to think if like context is still the right abstraction for this for a source like this. Because let's say that like we're saying that a source is gonna have metadata right? And it's gonna produce output fields which include that metadata, right?
Mm.
Um the So it's taking like a full step back. A source does not care about the documents fields. It only cares about its own metadata. When you read a source, it pulls in obviously the source and gets the metadata associated with that source. So like as you read files in, you get the content of that file plus the associated metadata, right? The document fields are added by like validating the document schema against the document and done at a separate point. So I almost think that the source doesn't need to know anything about the fields. All it needs to know about is its own meta.
I kind of think of the source as the source of information for these fields, not rather than just where the content lives. Uh, I mean, the root level of the source, which is this file system, doesn't care about fields. Well, somewhere we need to put these plugins, where it's in a separate thing under source, or whether it's part of the document source. I mean, either of those is fine by me. But plugins should be able to access, no matter where they are in the stack, the original information or the original content, if possible.
Yeah, I think the current version of Contentlayer, if we're talking specifically, like again, if we just scope it down to just Markdown for a minute,
Yeah.
the current version of Contentlayer has some default, like, unified stuff that it adds, I think. I'm pretty
Yeah.
sure. Like, the stuff to basically transform the markdown,
Mm.
whatever, and then you can specify additional plugins, but, like, the default for markdown files is to basically parse it into a format that the document can then handle. Um
It would be nice if metadata was generic here, so it'd just be like metadata file.
Yeah, because I think in the implementation of source that I had worked on when I wasn't using context and was like, again, just considering source a document source not associated with fields, metadata was a generic on source, or meta was a generic on source. And then, like, in different specific sources, like the file system source, extended the like file system meta. And then you could use that file system source to extract like the metadata, basically. But with context in the mix, it does become a little bit difficult.
Maybe if we have define like a wrapper type interface output, you know, and that's gonna have its own hyperD type, like be ouch, hyperD, and that would be a unique symbol dot or oops, sure, core source output. Thank you, Copilot. And then fields can be on here. And then we can move our content here. Uh, and then we can add our metadata. Yeah. And then a source would just be a stream of these output things. Here is source provided. Let's see how that sticks. And a file system source. I think we can get rid of this alias now. And this can just be a plain interface that extends the past path that we mentioned earlier and adds the full path in the file name. Oh, can't. It's class. I did. Now we are a source that outputs file system emitter. This contains effectful stuff. So it can't be a schema. And we just add a constructor for output. We just need a convenient way of making an output object.
So
Make
far,
output.
so far I like this approach more than the previous.
And options would just be this.
This is
Okay.
like more similar to like what I had originally had, which I think it'll make it easier to. I think it'll make it easier. I also am starting to understand what you were saying about thinking about the source as a source for the fields, because if we're basically creating a stream of these like output objects, then it starts to make a little more sense what you were saying before about like having the source be a literally a source for the fields rather than just a source of documents.
Okay, I think we have everything we need here. To build the output. We'll just copy paste that. What are we missing? We need to spread in the pass path. So we pull in the path service here. It was imported as the top. Okay. So here we would go path to pass. It's the full path in name. Did I not? What I added there? I did. What is it saying? Path does not exist. Oh, of course. So this is going in the meta field. Fields is missing. So at this stage we would have no fields. And we don't need this stat anymore.
Yeah, because we can determine the caching strategy later.
Yeah.
It's a problem for tomorrow, Max and Tim.
Yeah. Okay. There's assignable to type depth.
saying that the error type is never.
That shouldn't be a problem. Ah, is it supposed to be never? Source. Yeah, I didn't specify an error here. Contentlayer error. Great.
Nice.
All right, if we try that, see what happens. Uh, it's kind of confusing because you have like the CLI, but then you also have the config. So it's kind of like
Yeah.
two levels. We have some build errors in plugin now, which makes sense. So instead of output, we'll just be adding things to the field. So our plugin should probably now import source module. And so now our unified plugin, I guess I will just add some fields now. We'll add a body field from the value and spread in the front matter. What are we doing here? We're building the unified processor. And then for each output and the source, we are grabbing the content and processing it. Oops. I guess we rename that to output.
I think at the top of your method, you need source.source.
So we've got the output here, which is the unified output. Source.make output.
Probably what we'll want to do is maybe, I don't know if this makes sense to keep cloning the output for every plugin, but well, I guess it's not that big of a deal.
Yeah, I don't think it's not cloning the content itself. In this case, I guess we'll just be adding fields. Fields, and then we'll add, maybe we could add some like helper methods to make content easier to work with. Extends. Data. Dot class. And then here, add our type ID. And now we can add some helpers like add field.
Thank you, ChatGPT. I think you need to spread fields.
Yeah, I did. Thank you, Max.
Thank you, ChatGPT.
Yeah, we can get rid of that now. We go back to source plugin. Then we can go output, start add field, body. Body. Ooh, maybe we can add fields. Body will be v file dot value. And we want to add fields from the metadata. So maybe if we make that an option. In unified, you like build up a processor, which could be effectual. And then if we specify here like a bunch of fields we want to add from the metadata. Or maybe it could just be a function. Uh, data, or
Maybe like an extractor or something like that.
yeah, an extractor that will take the record of string unknown and produce a record of string unknown. Anyway, here we need to basically do that. So if, for example, for remark, it would be something like, and then
Okay.
probably could do a better name. Feels a little weird, but
All of this can be refined, I
yeah,
think. But I think we're on the right track. Does it work?
probably not. Here we go. Document.
Ah, yes, there's my
Fields.
little extractor in the documents. In the document.
Do we need that anymore? What is that?
That allows you to provide the source metadata to computed fields in a typed fashion.
Okay.
So yes, I would argue that that's a must because that's how Contentlayer currently computes a lot of its computed fields. You grab metadata and do stuff like to compute a slug, for example. So I had a little extractor built in there.
Uh, I guess we could just provide the full output. I'll just say meta, that's fine. Okay, this was a bit overzealous in accident. And here it would be,
The way I was doing it before was basically just inferring the meta argument.
yeah, source extend stream, upstream, output, meta. And then we'll just throw away
Could you not just infer
context.
the source? Because
Uh,
I guess this
so I
is
just got
like
it
more.
so it's pulling out the inner meta from
Yeah,
the
but the inner
source.
meta is the first type argument to source, right? So we could, in theory, just extract it directly from source.
Right.
No, we just have to change the name source. That's all.
This.
Thank you, ChatGPT. That was what ChatGPT originally suggested, which is the only reason I suggested.
Yeah, I just kind of use ChatGPT as a fast autocomplete and just ignore its ideas.
I found when I was using it that it slowed me down because I kept reading like what it was suggesting,
Oh, right, yeah, I've just
and I
learned to
was like,
ignore it most of the time.
yeah, like I was like, I had to get rid of it.
Okay.
Cool.
All right, I think this is workable.
Yeah, I think this is a good start for sure. Um, I do have to hop off in like 2 minutes.
Okay.
But I feel like this was a pretty good. I mean, you can feel free to keep going, but I think that this was like a pretty good milestone. Um, I like the direction. I also like I think like if there's a way we can get more of the plugin information typed, I don't know if there's a way, but if there is a way, maybe by
Hmm.
providing a schema to like the I don't know, like maybe by providing a schema or maybe by like, extracting type information from like whatever the plugin's doing, that would be good because then the extractor would be working with typed information instead of a record of string any. Um, but yeah,
Yeah,
this
I guess the field as being like a unknown record is okay because it's getting past the field schema anyway.
yeah, I just mean if you're going to be uh it depends on whether or not we're giving users access to it or not, I guess.
Yeah, I guess the only thing is like if plugins want to access output from other plugins, but that might be quite an edgy case.
Right. But anyways, this is really good progress. Thank you for taking the time also to catch me up on your work the last time you were doing this. Um, but yeah, we'll try to keep doing this on Wednesdays moving forward. Um, thanks, Tim.
Cool. I'll just commit this and I'll call it a day, I think.
Sounds good. Well, thank you everybody for joining, and until next time, cheers.
See ya.